Right, so this is going to be a long one. Hello everybody and welcome to Shay Says a Bunch of Nonsense about Sonic the Hedgehog. This is going to be a 3-part series in which I'll be musing over Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog franchise in an attempt to consolidate an idea of where it keeps going wrong. And this video is going to be split into 3 parts. I am the Peter Jackson of Sonic reviews apparently. In this first video, I'll be focusing exclusively on the gameplay of the Sonic series, before moving on to discuss the non-gameplay elements in the next video. For clarity's sake, I'll be going through the games in roughly chronological order. The spiel about Sonic's overall quality is a tired rhetoric that I'd really like to be able to spare you. Unfortunately, the entirety of the following 3 videos pretty much depends on it, so here we go. Back in the early 90s, Sonic the Hedgehog was on top of the world. Conceived as Sega's answer to Nintendo's Mario, the series enjoyed incredible success following the release of its first installment in 1991. It went from strength to strength in its early days on the Mega Drive, which statistically you'll probably know as the Genesis, before failing to capture that same success later on, due in part to the decidedly lower quality of the 3D installments. To put it diplomatically, since the Sega Saturn, the series has failed to achieve anything beyond a tentative and unfortunately temporary boost in quality. A good place to start then is by going back to the Mega Drive and seeing just what made the classic Sonic titles so good. And make no mistake, they were good. Sonic's incredible hype machine was backed by some genuinely great games. I think the first broad thing that needs to be established about these games is how right Sonic feels to control. Every single movement feels absolutely natural. The way that he gains speed, the way that he loses speed, the way that he interacts with the terrain, and the way that his jump reacts naturally to all of these factors. This results in a character that is immensely satisfying to control. It just feels right. One of the most important factors is the way that Sonic will maintain momentum without player input. If the player lets go of the D-pad whilst moving or while on a slope, Sonic will keep moving in that direction. This contributes massively to the feel of the momentum in the game. It's never a chore to get Sonic to move, and he'll react quite happily to both the environment and the player's input. As a result, the game has a very low skill threshold. The first time you play it, you know exactly how Sonic is going to move, and exactly how he's going to react to different factors as it feels completely natural. Complementing this is the control scheme, which is as simple can be. All 3 buttons make Sonic jump, and his only other action is to roll into a ball by pressing down whilst moving. Rolling exaggerates the way in which Sonic interacts with the environment. Rolling downhill speeds him up more quickly than if he were running. However, it also prevents Sonic from maintaining momentum. He has to rely on his inertia and the environment to build and keep speed while in a ball. The ring system is genius as well. Rings allow the pace to be entirely dictated by the player. The player only needs 1 ring in order to survive a hit, and when hit, the rings scatter everywhere, allowing the player to simply grab one and get back into the action as quickly as they like. However, there are many benefits, such as points, extra lives and bonus stages, awarded for collecting and holding on to the rings, so it's in the player's best interest to collect as many as possible at the cost of time. The rings also amplify the tension. There is nothing quite so tense as approaching the end of a level with a ton of rings in tow, knowing that one false move could result in the loss of everything you've collected. Basically, the controls, physics and mechanics are simple elegance. Of course, this wouldn't mean much without level designs that took advantage of these mechanics. While Sonic 1's Marble Zone and Labyrinth Zone incorporated a lot more traditional platforming elements and were worse levels as a result, the rest of Sonic's debut game featured slopes, ramps, loops and wider platforms to really take advantage of his control scheme. Sonic 2, I feel, has worse level design. It tiers the levels, with the highest routes usually being the fastest and most thrilling way to reach the goal. The lower levels are usually less expedient as they have more obstacles. What this effectively means is that the player is encouraged to take the top route as it is the most optimal, and is rewarded for doing so with less gameplay. That's not to say that the game is bad, not at all. Sonic 2 accommodates speed a lot better than the first game and has a reduced emphasis on precise movement. Sonic's platforming shouldn't really be focused on the careful navigation of small and blocky platforms. Instead, it ought to be more focused on sloping, winding terrain and wider platforms that allow the player to maintain speed if they so desire. To put that another way, Sonic should be more about when you jump rather than where you jump. Sonic 2 has a lot more opportunities to take advantage of Sonic's momentum, especially with the brand new Spin Dash. The Spin Dash is an excellent addition to the game as it gives the player an option to gain speed extremely quickly. However, that give is not without some take. As the player is in a ball after using the Spin Dash, they are at the mercy of the terrain and thus must anticipate the terrain or time a jump correctly so as not to lose much momentum. The Spin Dash works perfectly with the established strengths and weaknesses of rolling. If you know when and how to use it, it's a massive advantage, but if used incorrectly, it will result in a lot of starting and stopping. As a result, Sonic 2 has a greater emphasis on learning the correct way to do the levels, which, well, that's the way it is. When we reach Sonic 3 and Knuckles though, oh boy, do you want to know how good this game is? Baby Jesus got given 3 gifts by the 3 wise men: gold, frankincense, Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Sonic 3 and Knuckles, henceforth referred to as Sonic 3 for simplicity's sake, took the first 2 games and made everything better. You could play as 3 characters with subtly different movesets: Sonic, Tails and Knuckles. These subtle differences mean all 3 play similarly, which makes no sense for Knuckles, we'll get to that in the next video, but allows all 3 to be easily accessible, while also having different nuances to master. Tails could fly and Knuckles could glide and climb walls, making exploration easier with these characters. Sonic, on the other hand, got an incredible new ability in the Insta Shield, which allows him to dispatch enemies with ease. Add in a climactic story and some amazing graphics and music, and you have one of the best 2D platformers ever made. But in order to truly understand how good Sonic 3 is, you have to understand what makes these Sonic games good in the first place. There's this common piece of adage that all good Sonic games are made up of 3 elements: speed, platforming and exploration. I think that's a really nice way of condensing it, but what I never see explored is what that really means. Firstly, the operative word in the phrase speed, platforming and exploration to me is the word "and". Later games in the series, such as Sonic Generations, have all 3 of these elements, but they're mostly separated into sections. You'll spend one part platforming and then the next part going at high speeds, and you get the idea. But these 3 criteria, if they're to create a satisfying experience, have to complement one another. They can't just exist in a vacuum. The strength of Sonic 3 is its ability to intertwine these elements to make the experience more than the sum of its parts. I'm going to introduce one more term that condenses speed, platforming and exploration, as well as the control scheme and level design. The term I'm going to use is fluidity. The momentum-based mechanics would be utterly useless without smooth, rolling level designs to take advantage of them. These rolling level designs create speed with downward slopes and reward this speed with upward slopes, specifically the ability to scale them and gain extra height with well-timed jumps. These speedy, well-timed jumps can help reach new heights and allow the player to explore the level more thoroughly. Because this requires the player to be able to jump and land correctly, it also incorporates platforming. Because all 3 of these elements flow into one another so seamlessly, and because the player can experiment with these and use them to explore without being hampered by the game, it results in a very fluid experience, hence fluidity. It's not the best term and I'll readily admit that, but hopefully you'll understand what I mean when I say it. Let's look at some examples. In Collision Chaos from Sonic CD, a game I'll get to in a bit, there are these massive half-pipes. Speed is required to reach new heights in these half-pipes. Vertical momentum is transferred into horizontal momentum, which is subsequently transferred back into vertical momentum when the player scales the other end, rewarding them with more speed before the process repeats anew. Platforming is required to get oneself in the right position to fully take advantage of the slopes. These then facilitate exploration as they allow the player to explore new heights. Another example would be this section from Hilltop Zone in Sonic 2, where well-placed speedy jumps allow the player to explore the upper path of the level. Even when exploration is not present, you are almost constantly rewarded for skillful management of speed and use of platforming skills. Take this iconic moment in Sonic 1 for example. You start off having to overcome the loop, which is an obstacle that you need speed to get around. You then go into these underground tunnels before being launched high into the air, where skillful platforming will allow you to land in the Buzz Bomber, potentially netting you more rings. What's more, there are platforms up there that show that this part of the level isn't even mandatory. The bottom line is, all of this feels like you are doing it. It never feels like you're following the level designer's rules, it feels like you're exploring a complete environment. So, anyway, what does this have to do with Sonic 3 and Knuckles? well, the risk of sounding like a hacky writer, everything. Sonic 3's level design blends the three key elements of speed, platforming and exploration perfectly, and creates a more fluid experience as a result. No one element is overdone or underdone, it's spot on. Even collecting the Chaos Emeralds ties seamlessly into these elements. Rather than simply requiring the player to have 50 rings at either the goal or a checkpoint, the giant rings were instead secreted around the landscape, encouraging the player to stop running right and follow that hunch that might lead them to a hidden room. Adding to this are the three elemental barriers, which replace a standard barrier found in the previous Sonic games. Each elemental barrier grants Sonic brand new abilities that require experimentation to master, adding a further layer of depth to the game. Admittedly, they do remove the insta-shield, which makes some enemies impossible to dispatch, but overall I think they're an excellent inclusion. I'm going to take the waterfall climb from Angel Island Zone Act 2 as my major example here, as I think it shows just how all of this comes together in an easy to digest sequence. You start at the bottom of the waterfall using a spin dash to turn some horizontal momentum into vertical momentum. You then climb some platforms with speed aiding in making them easier to navigate. Then, by exploring, you're able to find a water barrier which, if you didn't know, allows you to bounce. Thus, by using some speed and platforming as well as the water barrier, you can just show off. All of these elements come together to create a series of games that hit that ever desirable state of being easy to pick up and play, while also having a high skill ceiling for those that want to reach it. The control scheme that is simple enough to explain in a sentence, and the physics engine which feels natural and thus is easy to grasp, combined with the level design which doesn't demand much but can accommodate so much more, to create a series of games that satisfy both speed freaks and people who demand more sophistication from their games. And yeah, I did just describe Sonic as sophisticated. See, there's this misconception that Sonic ought to be all about the speed, that it's just shallow, instant gratification for action junkies. I don't think it is though, and I think the easiest way to prove that is to point to the only serious contender to Sonic 3 and Knuckles' throne, Sonic CD. Sonic CD is a game that seems to divide people. I've seen a lot of people laud it as one of Sonic's greatest games, and I've seen a lot of people dismiss it as highly overrated. I can't cite those sources, but then I'm not a Wikipedia article, and my granny always told me that sources are for ninnies. It's why I'm failing university. To me, Sonic CD is like all of the things that I've talked about so far condensed. Exploration is made a focus as you have to travel back into the past to destroy the machines that are cyberforming the planet in the future. How do you explore? Through speed and platforming. This exploration is absolutely the focus of the game. The levels are a lot taller with multiple ways to quickly reach the top and the bottom of the landscape, unlike Sonic 2, which frequently prevented you from returning to the top of the level if you fell down. Sonic CD helps this by refusing to include any bottomless pits except in the final level, and one of my few criticisms with the game is that the final level is a bit pants. This removes a potential inhibition to the exploration. The player is never anxious that falling from a great height might result in an instant death. It's an attitude that I think a lot of the later games could really stand to learn from, taking place as they do, suspended over perpetual instant death. This focus on exploration resulted in a fairly large problem though. If you just run to the goal in each level in Sonic CD, the game is pathetically short. As the game is in 2D, the exploration has to be restricted exclusively to variations on your vertical position. And as the game can't risk you passing a point of no return and missing your chance to hit the cyberforming device, the levels became shorter to prevent backtracking from becoming a chore. As a result though, the goal can be reached very quickly. This basically stipulates in the way that you play. If you're just trying to finish the game, you're going to end up with short and unfulfilling levels. If you're trying to beat the game fully, you're forced to explore, which gives you tons more content. I think this is why the game is so divisive. It caters to one playstyle. Personally, I love CD and I have tons of fun just mucking about in the surreal and expansive playground, but I can see why people don't like it, and I think that Sonic 3, which manages to blend both playstyles more seamlessly, is the stronger game as a result. In summary, the classic games are just bloody good. But before we move on, I'd like to take a moment to talk about a couple of the broader problems that the classic series faces. The first is that the emphasis on speed restricts how the games can be designed. Again, I'm going to come back to this in the next video, but I just want to leave the seed of the thought in your mind that every playable character has to be designed like Sonic. Anyway, that's for later. The Labyrinth Zone is infamous for a reason. It's a slow, frustrating chore of a zone. I know the old story about the developers mistakenly believing that hedgehogs couldn't swim, but I think that the way the water was handled displays gameplay limitations more than anything else. Sonic's mechanics don't lend themselves to swimming, so he was simply made to sink and became slower and more floaty underwater. It's interesting that this gameplay change then is almost unanimously loathed. Sonic 2 even seemed to recognise this, as it used water as a punishment in zones like Chemical Plant and Aquatic Ruin. You have to try to avoid the changing gameplay style. I know that on the whole water levels tend to be disliked, but I think that it's telling that the change of pace afforded by the water levels became a punishment in Sonic later on. Now, Hydro City did manage to make the water interesting and fun with the addition of speed boosters, flumes, and the water barrier. But that was very carefully designed, and I think it shows how meticulously Sonic needs to be thought through when faced with changes to the core mechanics. I think it's telling that the series never attempted an ice level until Sonic 3, but even then, questions like how will ice and snow affect the physics are largely ignored. I'm not saying it would have been better with ice physics, I'm just making the observation that Sonic is treading on eggshells when he steps outside of his comfort zone. This can perhaps be seen as restrictive. In fact, heck, we don't even need to go into 3D to see how easy it is for small changes to trip Sonic up. The Sonic Advance series has plenty of little niggles to pick at. Now, let me state up front, for on-the-go fun, the Sonic Advance series is just great. I love these games and I will happily play them in the car, in my bed, in the car, at school, in the car, and of course at the side of the road as I try to distract myself from the travel sickness. But I think that the series has some pretty wonky level designs. In Ice Mountain, a single jump sends me hurtling into a bottomless pit. I know that I can't really call it a bad game for me falling down a pit, but basically the game is punishing me for experimenting and exploring. It's communicating to me that I have to follow its instructions at all times. Yet in Egg Rocket I am punished for taking this speed booster and then rewarded for making this leap of faith down what could well be a bottomless pit. It's confusing and contradictory level design. And that's to say nothing of the sheer amount of times I was blindsided by an enemy I had no hope of anticipating. The classic series always made it feel justified when you took a hit or died, and I think that the Advanced series is less solid for not managing this. Still though, the Advanced series does a ton of things right. While it's testament to how easy it is to unbalance the game, it's also testament to how strong the core Sonic formula is. All three are, at worst, fun. You hurtle through loops and springs, the aesthetics and music are totally evocative of Sonic without just being Mega Drive retreads, and it's got some really great and interesting ideas. The first thing I really want to compliment is Amy Rose, and that is not a sentence I'm used to saying. See, Amy in Sonic Advance 1 played vastly differently to the other characters. Rather than spinning and jumping and curling into a ball to attack, Amy would instead have to manually attack with her hammer. This made the experience distinct from Sonic's. Rather than simply being the same game as the same character again but with a couple of different moves, you're playing as a unique character with her own strengths and weaknesses. You'd have to approach the same situation in a different way. Amy also had a massive advantage in her use of springs. By bashing a spring with her hammer, it would double the strength of the spring, allowing Amy to take massive shortcuts. As a result, Amy's playthrough was the most fun I had playing Sonic Advance besides that initial playthrough as Sonic himself. The second thing I want to compliment from the Advance series is the Boost mode from Sonic Advance 2. I might spin some heads by saying this, but I honestly think that the Boost mode is the single greatest addition to the core Sonic formula that the series has had since the Spin Dash. It complements the core mechanics perfectly. Boost mode, unlike the later versions where you could just press a button to activate it, only activates after you've done a substantial amount of running. The game thus rewards you for running, which is obviously a huge core mechanic. Additionally, the time taken to reach Boost mode gets shorter the more rings you have, adding more reward to collecting them and adding more tension to losing them. Most importantly though, it also integrates itself seamlessly with the core gameplay. The first big advantage to being in Boost mode is the extra attack that you're granted. This attack allows you to harm enemies without needing to slow down. The second big advantage is that it ups your acceleration to max, so as long as you don't come to a dead stop, you can reach top speed instantly when you start back up. In allowing the player easy access to speed however, it never becomes as simple as pressing a button. It's entirely about possessing the skill necessary to never come to a complete stop and end the boost mode during the trickier sections. Putting all of this together, what this means is that the boost mode exponentially rewards the player for playing well. By mastering the core mechanics, the player is rewarded with a way to avoid the downtime. And the better the player masters the game, the more they're rewarded. All of that aside though, it's just bloody satisfying. There's a visible sonic boom and a really meaty whoosh sound before the character is followed by these really cool after images. When I was a kid, my exposure to Sonic was through the UK comic and Sonic 3D Flicky's Island. So when I saw Sonic reach those insane speeds in the car on the way back from buying my very own Game Boy Advance, I cheered. And then I threw up on the side of the road. Anyway, we're about 20 minutes into this and I haven't even started talking about bringing Sonic into 3D. Told you this was going to be a tough one. So the Sega Saturn came and went and the Dreamcast arrived with Sonic Adventure in tow. This was Sonic's first true 3D outing. No, we don't count Sonic 3D. Nor do we count Sonic R, go and stand in the corner. There's this common phrase that Sonic doesn't work in 3D. I'd like to revise that to Sonic hasn't worked in 3D. I think that, by rights, the fluidity of Sonic ought to work better in 3D. The speed would be supplemented, as there would be no danger of hitting an obstacle that approached from off-screen at speed. It would also have the advantage of actually being able to appear fast. I think it's difficult to get the same sense of speed in 2D as you can in 3D. The platforming, by rights, should go hand in hand with 3D, as Sonic's platforming isn't about acts of extreme precision, neither is 3D platforming. The exploration would be better because, well, it's obvious, do I really need to say it? It has an entire new axis to work with. Rather than only being able to explore left, right, up and down, you have the entirety of a 3D world to explore. So, how does Sonic Adventure fall short in these elements? Well, it kind of doesn't. Sonic Adventure, in my opinion, is the closest we have gotten to seeing the promise of 3D Sonic delivered. Every level has plenty of high-speed thrills, platforming challenges, and environments, not just routes, to explore. I think Sonic Team appreciated a lot of the differences between 2D and 3D and weren't afraid to change convention to accommodate the jump. As a basic example, the monitors were changed to capsules so that you could see what was in them from any angle. Now, that said, Sonic Adventure is not perfect, and honestly I'd hardly describe it as good by today's standards, but it does a lot of stuff right and I think that ought to be recognised. In my wafflings about Sonic Adventure, I'm going to be comparing it to Mario's first 3D outing, Super Mario 64, throughout. I have a hard time deciding how much I actually like Mario 64 as a game, but at the same time, I have an immense amount of respect for it, for acknowledging the differences between 2D and 3D and seamlessly incorporating them into its design. Of course, Sonic Adventure is a 3D platformer itself, and so I think there's a lot of benefit in contrasting Sonic's first 3D outing with the quintessential 3D platformer. However, this isn't really a comparison. I don't intend to reveal much about Mario 64 here. The comparisons with Super Mario 64 will be restricted to where they reveal something about Sonic Adventure's design. Sonic Adventure's controls are nice and simple. Simple controls were Sonic's bread and butter back in the 2D days, and it's nice to see that they've been expanded in Sonic Adventure only where absolutely necessary. Namely, the spin is now mapped to its own button, as obviously pressing down would manoeuvre you towards the screen. The only problem I have with the controls themselves is that L and R are mapped to turning the camera around, which was an archaic design choice even by the time the GameCube remake rolled around. I understand that the Dreamcast didn't have a right analog stick, but, well, every console Sonic Adventure has been on since has. Sonic's feel has also changed as it must in the transition to 3D. Sonic feels smooth and fun to control in general. His jump's kinda floaty, but it works just as well as you'd expect. The speed physics found in the 2D games are here. Jumping off a ramp at speed will result in a lot of height and distance, although Sonic's interaction with inclines and loops has been made almost non-existent, which I think is a shame as it robs you of some cool level design potential. Sonic's speed has been handled very well. The tighter you turn, the more speed Sonic loses. Making wide turns allows Sonic to maintain his speed. It's a subtle mechanic, but one that works perfectly with a character that runs this quickly, and one that feels absolutely congruent with the control scheme. Unfortunately, all of this work is ruined by one mechanic, the spin dash. In the 2D games, as established, the spin dash had a great give and take. It gave speed while taking away control. In this game, pressing the spin button while already in a ball allows Sonic to uncurl. Furthermore, the spin dash can be activated on a dime and requires no charge up. Basically, by hammering the B button, Sonic maintains a constant top speed without any consequence. The spin even controls as smoothly as running does, so there's absolutely no reason not to be hammering the B button, except for those occasional scripted sequences that freak out if Sonic is in a ball. Sonic Adventure further fails in its controls by not capitalising on the major control innovations brought about by Mario 64 a couple of years earlier. Apparently Nintendo spent ages meticulously testing Mario's movement to ensure he felt natural to control. And natural to control he feels, as every single one of his actions, such as sliding, jumping or attacking, is influenced by how he was moving and hence how his momentum is travelling. Mario 64 blends function with flow. Not only does it make Mario feel natural, but in doing so it affords the player more utility. The side flip, for example, is necessary because the shift in momentum would result in a jump that feels differently to the normal jump, considering the change in weight and direction. At the same time, it is useful as it gives the player a quick way to gain extra height. Hence, it is both natural and useful. Sonic has no such nuance to his controls. His jumping only takes into account his movement when he is travelling in a straight line at speed. This results in much simpler controls. Sonic has better air control to compensate, which is a great decision, but he never feels quite as deep or natural as Mario does in his first 3D outing. But how can you have a discussion about 3D Sonic's controls without mentioning the homing attack? And what controversy this thing has caused. For those of you who don't know, the homing attack, it's an attack that homes in on enemies. By simply pressing jump in mid-air, Sonic will launch towards the nearest enemy, destroying it. This can be chained, so enemies hovering over a bottomless pit can be used as stepping stones to reach the other side. There are numerous problems with this. It makes every enemy encounter the same, and reduces them to simply pressing A and then A again. It also encourages lazy design, as all the designers need to do is position a row of enemies over a bottomless pit for a quick and easy action set piece. All the set piece involves is simply for the player to press A over and over again. The biggest problem with the homing attack, in my opinion, is that it utterly kills momentum. No matter how fast you're going, it always makes Sonic go at the same speed, and then stop once it ends. Whereas in the old games there was a flow to gaining speed and losing speed when you attacked an enemy, with the homing attack you start stop, killing any momentum. Finally, the homing attack has a bit of a tendency to get mixed up, either choosing the wrong target or not choosing a target at all. There is nothing more frustrating than careering into an enemy you weren't targeting, or coming up short of an enemy and taking a hit. Now, despite these problems, I can see why the homing attack was implemented. Like it or not, you can't be as accurate in 3D as you could in 2D. For characters like Tails and Knuckles, this wasn't such a huge problem. Tails has a tailspin that can take out surrounding enemies without much of an issue. Knuckles has punches and a glide, and besides which his levels don't tend to have him going at insane speeds. But with the speeds that Sonic goes at, dispatching enemies would become a fiddly chore without this crutch. I think that the homing attack is a necessity. However, I don't think it's ever really been thought through. Why not tie the homing attack to Sonic's speed? Rather than requiring him to jump first, why not have it as its own action, so that it can be used seamlessly in conjunction with Sonic's running? Maybe that way the challenge can shift from actually using the attack to maintaining your speed as you use it. That's one idea, but basically I think that the homing attack is a good decision on paper. I just don't think it's ever really been executed to its full potential. Overall, I'd say that Sonic Adventure does a good job bringing Sonic's controls into 3D, but there's definitely room for improvement. The levels are in much the same boat. Super Mario 64 understood that it would be difficult to craft as many levels as it could in 2D, so it instead made 15 levels and ensured that the player got the most out of them by requiring them to complete multiple missions within these levels. I think that's a good decision. However, I find that fatigue sets in during the later missions in a level. Collecting the star boots you out of the level, resetting all of your progress. To collect the next star, you have to retrace your steps in a lot of cases. In short, traversing the same terrain multiple times can and does get boring. Sonic Adventure, with its 6 playable characters, instead asks the player to approach a level in different ways. The same terrain is recontextualised by the player in accordance with the character that they're playing as. The best example I can think of is the difference in mentality when approaching a level as Sonic and approaching that same level as Knuckles. With Sonic, you launch through the level as quickly as you like. As Knuckles, you have to find 3 randomly placed emeralds, so you have to climb and dig and explore thoroughly in order to root them out. I'm not going to say that Sonic Adventure necessarily approaches the reuse of levels better than Mario 64 does, as Mario 64 does a lot of work to ameliorate its problems, and besides which, who cares? But there are 3 major problems with using multiple characters. Firstly, they require the player to learn multiple playstyles. This isn't really a problem for Sonic, Tails and Knuckles as they function very similarly, but I think it is a problem for Gamma, Amy and Big, who all control vastly differently. Secondly, none of these characters have had the full attention of the development team. The developer's attention had to be split 6 ways, and so none of these characters are truly fleshed out. Finally, if any of these characters are not fun to play, the player will spend at least 1/6 of the game waiting for it to be over. Unfortunately for me personally, only Sonic is truly fun to play. Tails and Knuckles are alright to play as, but their levels are simply too short, and in Knuckles' case, sometimes confusing. Gamma's levels, which are shooting galleries, are a decent distraction, but they're easily forgotten about once completed as they're short and extremely easy. Amy's levels involve her running away and hiding from an invincible robot in a faux stealth section, and I feel that it's incredibly slow and clunky. Big's levels are fishing in a Sonic game. As a result, I only really enjoy 1/6 of Sonic Adventure, which isn't really a great number. On a small tangent, while it's easy to question the inclusion of characters like Big and Gamma, I think it has to be remembered that Sonic Adventure was trying to demonstrate the Dreamcast's capabilities as a console, possibly even prioritising this over revitalising the Sonic series. Sega building basic shooting and stealth mechanics into Sonic Adventure might have been intended to show how the console could handle those gameplay styles. Even the fishing places a focus on the game's ability to render water, which Sega were keen to push. In fact, Chaos himself was designed for this very purpose. So now that I've banged on about the philosophy behind the level design, it's time to move on to the levels proper. Sonic 3 and Knuckles created brilliant environments that felt like a complete in-depth world that you just so happened to be whizzing through. Sonic Adventure made moves towards replicating this effect and managed to succeed in a lot of ways. The environments are contributed to by the connecting hub worlds, which establish where each level resides in relation to each other. The hub world then fulfills the same purpose as the end of level cutscenes in Sonic 3. It doesn't completely succeed, as it's still nebulous as to where levels like Windy Valley and Speed Highway actually are, but I think it's a good attempt, and it provides some nice downtime between the action stages. The hub worlds are small enough that you can reach where you want to be quickly as well, while also being large enough that they can provide some scope for exploration. In addition, they allow the player a safe environment to get to grips with the character's mechanics. It's not perfect, but it's a good attempt, and I think it shows how hub worlds aren't necessarily incompatible with Sonic. The stages themselves, unfortunately, provide a little less scope for exploration. Sonic Adventure is probably the 3D Sonic with the most opportunity for exploration, but even then it falls short in so many ways. While the levels frequently open up to become environments, they spend just as much time, if not more, as linear pathways. Often, these linear pathways will be riddled with speed boosters and set pieces. These effectively wrench control away from the player and ask them to be dazzled by the action sequences as if it were a movie. Even worse, these set pieces have an infamous propensity for glitching out and sending the player hurtling towards an undeserved death. I think the easiest way to demonstrate the disparity between the 3D games and the Mega Drive titles is by comparing the loops. In Sonic 1, the loop was an obstacle. The player had to build speed in order to overcome it, and it felt good as a result, as it looked cool, you accomplished the task of your own accord, and you were rewarded for it with more speed. In Sonic Adventure, it is literally impossible to fail to get around a loop. Through multiple speed boosters and a preset path, the game forces you through its loops whether you want to go through them or not. The obstacle is reduced to a spectacle. Loops prevent backtracking as well. If you go through a loop but want to explore an earlier area, well, tough. It's a real shame. The beta version of Windy Hill is a lot wider and more fluid, and there's a lot less forced progression in general. The linearity in set pieces are a problem because on subsequent run-throughs of a level, this spectacle is reduced to extended periods of complete boredom. Go and watch your favourite action sequence in anything you like. Now, it might take a few run-throughs, but I can guarantee that that action sequence will stop being exciting if you keep watching it. In Sonic, this means that you're just staring at the screen watching him do something that was cool the first time, but has long since ceased to be. I don't give a hoot about this Orca section anymore. I haven't enjoyed it in over 10 years, yet I'm forced through it every time I play Sonic Adventure. The most distressing thing about all of this though is that, like I said, this is still the best attempt at Sonic levels in 3D in my opinion. After these set pieces, the game usually opens up somewhat into 3D spaces that you can explore. This kind of level design appears less and less as the series goes on. Later games would become yet more linear with yet more speed boosters and yet more set pieces, meaning yet less gameplay in the game that you're supposedly playing. In the interests of fairness, I have to point out that the closest I think we've come to open level design since Sonic Adventure is in Sonic 06's Wave Ocean. As far as I know, it was crafted as a giant interlinked environment which gave plenty of options for exploration. And, well, I think it's a shame that that potential was never fulfilled, to put that delicately. Even the best of Adventure's levels, however, suffer from a problem that only becomes worse as the Sonic series goes on. The abundance of instant kill fields. Bottomless pits in less anal terms. I want you to take a look at the very first level of Sonic Adventure, Emerald Coast. It takes place almost entirely surrounded by ocean, which will kill Sonic instantly. I'm not pretending that it's a difficult level, but give me a minute and you'll see where I'm going with this. Windy Valley takes place suspended in the air with bottomless pits on all sides. Tilting the analog stick slightly too far in a lot of instances can result in a death. Speed Highway, bottomless pits everywhere. Red Mountain has both bottomless pits outside and lava inside. In Skydeck you've got to be careful not to fall off. Or actually, to be honest, you're going to fall off even in supposedly solid land. Even the levels that I haven't mentioned have frequent and liberal use of bottomless pits on all sides. This keeps the linearity high and adds what I consider to be detrimental frustration in a number of cases. It doesn't feel exhilarating or free when you're carefully manoeuvring over small platforms. Sections like this can be used to induce tension in the player, but I can't help but see it as a design problem for these conditions to make up the majority of the game. I think it also gives the game a more blurry difficulty curve. In the interests of transparency, full credit for the following observation goes to Matthew Matosis. In Super Mario 64, the game has a very logical, very clear difficulty progression. Earlier levels have no instant kill fields, middling levels have fields that can slowly kill or damage the player, and it's only in the later levels that the game punishes poor platforming with instant death. In Sonic Adventure, however, the first level takes place almost entirely surrounded by instant kill fields, whereas the last level uses these a lot more sparingly. The last level is definitely a lot more difficult, but I can't help but feel that this difficulty progression is at least somewhat confused. I think it demonstrates that less careful thought went into Sonic Adventure. At the very least, I think instant kill fields ought to be carefully considered rather than just placed willy-nilly. So, to wrap up Sonic Adventure. It's a fun but heavily flawed game. I haven't really talked at all about all the glitches and camera issues, but yeah, there are glitches and camera issues all over the shop. I've heard Sonic Adventure defended as not being that glitchy. I'm not going to condemn or defend its glitches, but all I would say is, if you've played the game since you were a kid, the next time you pick it up, actively try to make it glitch out. In actively trying to activate them, you will notice so many little things that you subconsciously sidestep. So many little areas that seem like they would be fine but will probably result in a glitch. The big one for me was realising how often I subconsciously avoided rolling on set pieces and loops because I know that will immediately make the game glitch out, even though it is a perfectly reasonable thing for the game to be expected to do. The major problem with the camera is that it keeps wrestling control away from the player. If you want to go on an alternate path or backtrack, the camera will constantly fight to get you back on the path the game wants you to go on. It hasn't aged well. But then, I don't really think that Super Mario 64 has aged all that well either. Again, I'm going to stress it's an incredibly designed game, huge respect for it, and I think it's leagues better than Sonic Adventure simply because 100% of it is fun to play, rather than only a fraction of it. But I think that Mario 64 is, at least in part, viewed so favourably because of what it enabled. Mario 64 was refined and its good points accentuated in its sequels and of course in other 3D games. I can't speak for everybody, but when I go back to replay Mario 64, I'm able to look past a lot of its more archaic design choices because I know that they are refined and fixed going forwards. It's a product of its time that has since had its kinks ironed out. Sonic Adventure sequels, on the other hand, seemed only to accentuate its bad design decisions, while slowly phasing out the good. I would posit that if Sonic Adventure sequels had built on its strengths, it'd be looked back on more favourably as an aged product of its time. As its sequels only seem to get worse and worse, however, its bad points are often accentuated, and its good points overlooked. When I say that its sequels only got worse, I include Sonic Adventure 2 in that, unfortunately. I'm not really going to make any friends by saying this, but I consider this game to be the beginning of the downward slope for the series. I'll be talking largely about the story and atmosphere of the game in the next video, but for just now, I'll be comparing the gameplay of Sonic Adventure 2 to Sonic Adventure 1. Sonic Adventure 2 is a really ambitious game. While it pared back the 6 gameplay styles to 3, it opted to include unique levels for every character. The game has over 30 levels and it ought to be applauded for managing to make each one feel substantial. That's pretty much where my praise ends though. Although the playable styles had been reduced, each one had been made worse than its counterpart in Sonic Adventure 1. The first problem is the controls. All of the characters have been given more moves, but the simple control scheme has not been adapted to accommodate this. This means that all of the moves are assigned to a single action button. Now, context-sensitive actions can be done well, and in fact Tails and Eggman have 3 moves assigned to the action button, but this never becomes confusing. The Vulcan Cannon, the short-range attack, and the homing missiles are all activated and used in different ways, and there has never been a time when I used one of the 3 moves by accident. However, Sonic and Shadow have 3 actions assigned to the action button as well: the Somersault, the Lightspeed Dash, and the Spin Dash. These are activated by pressing B, and pressing B for slightly longer, respectively. It doesn't help that the Somersault is an absolutely useless move that kills all momentum and could have been integrated without issue into the Spin Dash. Combined with the homing attack air dash confusion from Sonic Adventure 1, there are a lot of times where the controls are just not on the same wavelength that you are, which is a massive problem. If a character doesn't control well, it doesn't matter how well the rest of the game is designed. You encounter everything in the game through the medium of the character you are playing as, so if that conduit is broken, the rest of the experience will be tainted as well. Sonic and Shadow control about as well as Sonic did in the first adventure, but the confusion between the Somersault and the Spin Dash, and the fact that the Somersault completely ruins all momentum, can make them feel a bit choppy. Knuckles and Rouge are largely the same as Knuckles was in Adventure 1, but attacking can sometimes lead to the character careering off in a straight line, which, again, can result in them feeling a little more clunky. Tails and Eggman, who have adopted Gamma's style from Sonic Adventure, control much, much worse. Their machines are bulky and heavy. They just feel bad to control. They're not just clunky, they're clunk incarnate. I understand that extra weight to a character can feel satisfying, but this isn't. It's just awkward. Overall, I just feel that Sonic Adventure 2 is much less smooth. The levels have only gotten worse as well. The removal of a hub world and the way that the story jumps around makes each level feel like a level, rather than an environment. This is compounded by the levels feeling like they were designed for their respective characters. One of the major advantages of multiple characters visiting the same level was that the environment had to be designed for those multiple playstyles, and so it felt less like it was designed with a certain character's abilities in mind. Here, every moment of the game is designed to play in a certain way, and as a result, it feels a lot less like a real place that you just so happen to be whizzing through. The levels feel completely removed from the surrounding environment, with half-pipes and thin walkways suspended over nothing, for no reason other than to accommodate the character. The level's mechanics have gotten worse as well. Sonic and Shadow's levels have little in the way of exploration, feeling like a succession of linear paths rather than a 3D space. This problem is compounded by the new rail grinding mechanic, which takes linearity to its logical extreme. I can see the purpose behind the mechanic's inclusion in this game, besides the sponsorship, and in all fairness, Sonic Adventure 2 does grinding pretty well, with it requiring constant input to maintain speed around corners, and usually being used as an alternative to other routes. Nevertheless, it does allow the game to dictate the player's direction to quite an extraordinary degree, and this problem has only gotten worse in future games. Anyway, Tails and Eggman's levels have less of a focus. Gamma had a time limit during his levels, which could be increased by dispatching multiple foes at once. This element is gone in Sonic Adventure 2, so Tails and Eggman don't have much tension or drive to their levels. Finally, Knuckles and Rouge's levels managed to actually impress me by making a treasure hunt linear. See, in Sonic Adventure, Knuckles' radar would ping no matter which emerald piece he was near. In Adventure 2, however, the radar only acknowledges one emerald piece at a time. The game has a set order it wants you to find the emeralds in, and in an inherently non-linear experience, it tells you to do it in a specific order. It's bonkers. The sensation that the game wants you to play it in a certain way is only compounded by the inclusion of a ranking system. You get graded on how well you complete the level, encouraging multiple playthroughs to try and suss out the way the game wants you to play it to get an A rank. Honestly, I really dislike the ranking system. It fundamentally changed the way in which the game was played. For example, it changes the way that the rings feel. The tension of running with a lot of rings was changed to genuine stress, as taking a hit resulted in your missing an A rank. I know plenty of people, myself included, that simply restart the level if they so much as take a hit or miss the optimal route. It makes the whole game feel like there's a very specific way to play it, which is needlessly restrictive in my opinion. Pretend there's a good way to segue into Super Sonic here. At this point, Super Sonic has become too much of a staple of the franchise to go much longer without mention. In the Mega Drive games, Super Sonic was a bonus for collecting all 7 Chaos Emeralds. He is invincible and he gains speed much more easily than Sonic. However, he can only be activated when the player has over 50 rings, and he consumes 1 ring per second. His weakness, effectively, is a time limit. It was a bit frustrating that he was incredibly easy to activate, as all one needed to do was jump in Sonic 2 or press A in the air in Sonic 3. I completely ruined the final boss for myself as I accidentally activated Super Sonic, destroying any tension or reward that the fight may have had. But otherwise, Super Sonic was a reward befitting the difficult task of gathering the emeralds. However, Sonic 3 started a trend with Super Sonic that only got worse as time went on: the final boss fight. A final boss ought to be a culmination of the game's mechanics. It ought to be the point at which all of the skills you've put to use throughout the game come together in one last climactic encounter. In Sonic 3, it wasn't too bad. The game gave you a tough final boss to face, and then, if you had all of the emeralds and thus had used Super Sonic before, you unlocked the Doomsday Zone. The Doomsday Zone lumps a whole new control scheme on your lap and asks you to learn it while fighting what should be the most difficult boss in the game. Still, it's a very simple control scheme and it doesn't take long to work out what's going on. In Sonic Adventure, Super Sonic controls exactly the same as regular Sonic. However, the player needs to get used to the fact that they're literally invincible, but on a time limit, as the rings are running down 1 per second. The first time I played as Super Sonic, which was the first time I had ever played as Super Sonic in the Sonic series, I wasn't paying attention to my rings, and I wondered what was going on when I died. Sonic Adventure 2, however, sets the standard for the rest of the series' final bosses and incorporates the worst of both worlds. The player immediately needs to get used to a whole new control scheme, and the fact that they're invincible, and the fact that they're on a timer. All this is happening while they face the final boss, which doesn't test the skills you've accumulated over the course of the game, but instead tests the skills you've literally only just learned. I'm not really going to rag too much more on Adventure 2. I thought I'd get my issues with it out the way though, because for experience's sake, I'm just going to skim over the rest of the series between this and Sonic Colors. Adventure 2 covers most of my big problems with the games I'm missing: sloppy controls and linear level design. Obviously, this isn't all of the problems, but do you really need me to tell you how much of a strange decision it was for Shadow the Hedgehog to have guns? And yes, this does mean I'm going to be skipping Sonic 06. Okay, look, Sonic 06 was a bad game. It was thoroughly dross. It was bad from the top of its head to the tips of its toes. It was also 8 years ago now, and everybody has lined up to take a pop at that dead horse. What more could I possibly bring to the discussion? I mean, look, if you're desperate to see what's wrong with Sonic 06, here's a link to a playlist of the Game Grumps playing it. It has 108 parts, each part is at least 10 minutes long, so that's well over 18 hours. If you don't have that much time, here's a link to the first part of Clement J642's review. It's 3.5 hours long. If that's still too much, Some Call Me Johnny's review of the game is 50 minutes long. Any of these 3 videos would inevitably cover all of the points I could possibly make. The only thing I have to say about Sonic 06 is, can we be done with Sonic 06? It's crap, and it's hilarious to see people reacting to how crap it is, but it almost eclipses the rest of the franchise. It precludes potentially valuable discussion about the rest of the series. A lot of the time, discussion about Sonic's output is referred back to Sonic 06, the sheer badness of which sucks in any and all reasoned critique. And I think there's a lot of valuable information, good and bad, to be mined from the rest of the series. So without further ado, let's start mining. I'm going to pick the series back up with 2011's Sonic Generations, but first I'd like to give a quick helping of praise to 2010's Sonic Colors, which I have a lot of fondness for. In the run-up to Colors, I was almost certain that the Wisps were going to be a flop. They would either completely overwrite the rest of the game, or they would be a gimmick that was used once or twice and then forgotten about. The only way that the Wisps would work would be if they were used to expand the levels, to allow the player to explore alternate routes and find hidden paths. Lo and behold, that's exactly what they were used for. It even tied into the ranking system, which no longer rewarded expediency, but experimentation with these Wisps. There were tons of lovely little touches, like the way that the game paused for a second when you used the Wisp to allow you to accommodate for the shifting control scheme, or the way that the Drill Wisp could be used in underwater levels to actually make them fun. I know, fun water levels, in a Sonic game. I also particularly love the final boss, which makes use of all of the abilities you've been using throughout the game. As a result, when the game cries Cube, you know what to expect. It's a great idea. The final boss should be a test of all the skills you've gathered up until that point. The final blow struck against the machine, where all of the Wisps team up to create a massive laser, is extremely climactic and satisfying. In my opinion, it's the best final boss the series has had since Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Colors wasn't without its problems, mind you. Some abysmally long periods with no interaction and some incredibly awkward jumping controls meant that it never quite reached the point of being an incredible game. But despite these problems, I always see people credit Sonic's brief return to form in the 2010s to Sonic Generations, and I can't help but wonder what the heck happened to Sonic Colors in that assessment. Anyway, speaking of Generations, let's just get right to it. I'm going to basically skip classic Sonic here. It's a reasonable facsimile of the Mega Drive games, but has none of the subtlety or nuance about it. That's not to say it's not fun though. I'm going to be concentrating on the modern Sonic formula established by the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions of Sonic Unleashed. I find modern Sonic's control scheme to be the absolute worst case scenario for a control scheme. The controls are quite complex. The A button jumps and homing attacks, the B button stomps and crouches, and the X button uses Sonic's boost, which is represented by a meter at the bottom of the screen. In order to accommodate the extreme speeds Sonic can reach whilst using this boost, as well as make up for the fact that he is quite stiff to control, the game has to use all 4 of the triggers to let him manoeuvre properly. L1 and R1 let Sonic quickly dash to the left or right, and the triggers let Sonic drift as if it's a racing game. In fact, this drift is the only way to tackle even the simplest of turns whilst moving quickly. Effectively, the triggers are dedicated to overcoming the limitations of the core control scheme. While it can be argued that this is good design as the designers noticed the flaws and rectified them, I would instead argue that a control scheme that requires 3 dedicated buttons in addition to the analog stick to simply turn is probably somewhat flawed. What's even worse than this though is that the mechanics of the game are fairly simple without much depth. While the Mega Drive game's simple control scheme disguised some complex mechanics, modern Sonic is the opposite with a complex control scheme that disguises some simple mechanics. I would call this a worst case scenario. Once you get used to the controls though, they function just fine. But let's look at how Sonic moves. As I've said, Sonic is incredibly stiff, especially when moving at speed. While turning quickly in Sonic Adventure would slow Sonic down, the option to turn quickly in Sonic Generations is completely gone. That is, of course, unless you use the drift. but try to control Sonic in the same way that you would control any other character, that is to say, just with the analog stick and using that to adjust your speed, and you will find that Sonic is incredibly stiff and unresponsive. Instead, you have to bring Sonic to a near stop and then turn. The jump doesn't react naturally to your speed, it always feels stiff, and the air dash and homing attack have no flow or momentum to them. You dive straight forwards and then straight up. There is absolutely no fluidity to these controls. The way the rings work has been changed as well. Rather than all of Sonic's rings scattering upon taking a hit, Sonic instead loses a percentage of them. This helps keep the pace up, but also makes the consequences of taking a hit more vague. When I take a hit, I'm not really sure how I ought to feel about it, as I can simply tap X again to regain all of my speed, and with rings in reserve to boot. The biggest oversight with the modern formula though is that there is absolutely no way to manipulate the camera. The right analog stick is doing nothing anyway, and yet the player is unable to change the camera to get a better view of their surroundings or see what they want to see. In a 2011 3D platformer, that is astonishing, and not in a good way. The reason this is the way it is though is because everything is designed to have Sonic hurtle forwards in a straight line as quickly as possible. Enter the boost. The boost is probably the most controversial addition to Sonic's arsenal since the homing attack, and it's easy to see the problems with it. By pressing one button, Sonic will immediately hit top speed, and by holding it, he will maintain this speed while also ploughing through any enemy unfortunate enough to get in his way. In Generations, it is extremely easy to spend the whole level boosting, as there's an abundance of rings and stunt pads which refill the boost gauge. The rings even home in on you if you run past them at speed, which I'll admit is incredibly satisfying, but it makes it ridiculously easy to boost forever. The problem with boosting forever is that it diminishes the impact of the speed. In the classic games, the player was forced to acquire speed for themselves, either by slowly building it up or by making use of the terrain. The games rightly acknowledged that speed is meaningless without context. If you spend the whole game moving at the speed of sound, then the speed of sound ceases to be valuable or exciting. You can argue that the boost is another way of earning your speed, as it requires the player to learn the level sufficiently to keep up with the pace. I'd argue that it's a less fun method given that it basically gives you the reward up front, that being Sonic's top running speed, but it's a good argument. The problem is how this constant high speed influences the level design. While there are multiple paths that intersect at various locations, the player still lacks much autonomy. You cannot make an informed decision about your environment unless you've played the game before. You simply choose a route with no idea where it will take you. You're not running on this wall because you saw the wall and got curious, you're running on the wall because you grinded on this rail a while ago and you have no way of getting off that path. Exploration in 3D should involve seeing something and wanting to go and investigate it. At the beginning of Bob-omb Battlefield, for example, the camera points in this direction. This is to try to interest the player in that mountain in the background where the goal is. Generations reduces this wonder to spectacle. What would be a point of interest is reached and passed before you even have the chance to see it coming. By the time you know this clock tower exists in Rooftop Run, you're already halfway up it. I can't help but feel that this makes the game quite claustrophobic, as these routes often give the player very little idea of where they reside spatially, and are often linear paths rather than 3D spaces. It also robs the player of a lot of their input and decision making. The level design, as a result, falls into a lot of the traps that Sonic Adventure 2 fell into. The ranking system asks the player to find an optimal route and stick to it. Combined with the linear level design, Generations has that old problem that Sonic 2 had, where the player is rewarded for skipping content and refusing to explore, a major come down after Colors punished the player for just rushing to the goal. While the clever application of speed used to reward you with more content, now the clever application of speed is to cut out parts of the stage. While thankfully the set pieces have become less invasive, you'll still find a number of occasions where you're just holding boost and occasionally tapping one of the bumpers. I rarely play City Escape, as the truck sequence just bores me to death at this point, and the first few minutes of Speed Highway are basically spent holding X. I think the major problem with the modern Sonic formula is that it reduces everything to a binary state. You're either boosting or you're not. You're either exploring or you're not. You're either platforming or you're not. I know that sounds weird, like, of course that's the case. But there's hardly any crossover or mingling of these concepts. Before, if you were going at speed, which was a variable, you would complement and facilitate the platforming and exploration, which were a lot more, well, fluid. In the modern Sonic formula, moving at speed detracts from the platforming and exploration. The speed is on, so the platforming and exploration are off. If you're exploring, often the speed and platforming are off. If you're platforming, you get the idea. It feels inherently less satisfying. When all three work together, it results in a well-rounded experience where all the little cogs mesh perfectly. When all three are separated, it feels a lot more like following instructions. Okay, here's an example. Let's take this section in Seaside Hill. You run down a slope before being jettisoned into the air by this ramp. You then run slightly further before pressing jump once to hit these rings, which, again, jettison you into the air. The speed in this is automatic. There is no flow to it, and the game either doesn't trust the player or doesn't trust itself to let higher speeds result in a further distance and airtime. If the game had fluidity, it would have put a slope here rather than a pre-programmed ramp, and would have let the player's speed dictate which path they went on. This would let them explore and would also put their platforming skills to the test as they would try to land on the platform over there, but it doesn't. It instead reduces the airtime to a certainty on the ramp, and then a binary input at the end. You either hit the rings, or you don't. If you do, the platforming and exploration are automated in order to get the player to the next speed section more quickly. Another way to put it is, here is the area that the player can be expected to travel in following the first ramp in Sonic 3. Here are the parts of the level the player can be expected to travel in during this sequence of Seaside Hill. In order to perhaps disguise how shallow this is, the game tries to distract the player with the picturesque scene of two orcas jumping overhead. Scale and perspective and spectacle are great things and should be a huge part of Sonic, but it has to have some sense of believability. When I'm running through most of the levels in Generations, I never get the feeling that they're complete worlds. There's little sense of wonder because you're stuck on a path and have little scope to walk around or look or explore. You can't even go back the way you came to see if you missed something. The camera won't let you, and besides which there's likely to be a speed booster or a loop that forces you to stick to the path. The illusion that this is a complete environment that you happen to be rushing through is rarely created, and when it is, such as brief moments in Seaside Hill, it becomes all the more disappointing when that illusion is shattered so easily. I find that my imagination has to do a lot of the work in these later games. If my imagination kicks in and I can pretend that I'm running through a fully 3D environment, I still have a good time, but that feeling only really comes in the first few playthroughs, and even then it's fleeting. Although I've spent this entire time slagging off modern Sonic, I have to say that I do enjoy it quite a bit. Generations is definitely the best Sonic game to have come out in years. It is simple, arcadey fun. For all my bluster and pretensions of being a game design criticism man, sometimes it's just fun to rocket through a level, and Generations caters to that ambition admirably. It's shallow as hell, but sometimes shallow's just what I want. Sometimes I just want to go back to Sky Sanctuary or Seaside Hill to experience the thrill of sending a cartoon Insectivore whizzing at top speed through fantastical terrain. Yes, it focuses on speed to the point of undermining the platforming and exploration, which are still there, just not the focus, but heck, sometimes I just want to go at top speed, you know? Sometimes I say, stuff the national speed limit, I'm doing 100, and then I throw up at the side of the road. I don't think Generations is a bad game at all, but I don't think it's fundamentally a solid game. It's like, right, okay, a good game has to be structurally sound. It has to have a good foundation and then be built up in a solid way. I don't think Generations has this structural integrity, but it manages to plaster over the cracks well enough that it's still good. Does that make any sense? Anyway, I think that the most damning thing about the modern Sonic formula is the fact that it has never once been attempted without a crutch. There is yet to be a game with the modern Sonic formula that is not in some way supplemented by another mechanic in order to pad out how inherently shallow modern Sonic is. In Unleashed, it was the Werehog. In colours, it was the Wisps, and in Generations, it was, of course, classic Sonic. These games also rely fairly heavily on their 2D sections. Both of these crutches seem to suggest that Sega don't have enough faith in the modern Sonic formula to allow it to carry a game on its own. And I think that says a lot more than any in-depth criticism of its mechanics ever could. So that brings us to Sonic Lost World. In 2013, Sega released a game with a brand new Sonic formula that seemed to combine elements from the cancelled Sonic X-treme and Super Mario Galaxy. And the final product reflects this confused and contradictory input. It's a muddle of elements from 20 plus years of video games all snowballed together. I think the first thing the game absolutely has to be congratulated for is its inclusion of speed, platforming and exploration in pretty much equal measure in the main levels. The tube-like level design allows multiple paths to be chosen at any one time. As the tubes are long, speed can be gained while travelling along them. Finally, there are plenty of opportunities to jump on various platforms, especially with Sonic's new parkour mechanics, which we'll get to in a bit. The game still forces you to keep going in one direction as there's no way to influence the camera, which is still embarrassing for a modern 3D platformer, but it's a bit of an improvement, I think. Or at least it would be if it weren't awkward and sluggish. Sonic's controls are abysmal in Lost World, some of the worst controls I have ever used. He doesn't build or lose momentum anything resembling naturally. If you let go of the analog stick, Sonic comes to an almost immediate stop. I could handle all of this though if it weren't for the following ruinous decision. Sonic moves at different speeds depending on which direction he's travelling. I'm not making that up. If he is moving forwards or backwards, he will move more quickly than if he's moving left or right. This makes turning feel stiff and strange as the game is trying to compromise two different speeds. It also makes the jump an absolute nightmare. If you're moving forward and suddenly need to jump left or right, you will go flying off in that direction in a way that feels really unnatural. In the opposite scenario, the jump will hardly take you anywhere. It makes it feel like you're controlling a different character based simply on the direction that he's facing. It's no wonder it's so difficult to get a handle on the bloody controls. I spent ages trying to work out why Sonic's jump and turn would randomly feel different. I thought it was a glitch, but no, somebody would have had to have sat down and decided to change the way that Sonic feels based on the direction that he's facing. I think that is a fascinating decision. And all of this is to say nothing of Sonic's moveset. He has absolutely no synergy between any of his moves. Okay, to explain this. In Team Fortress 2, as with most other games, each character has a multitude of weapons that are designed to work with that character's particular strengths. For example, the soldier, who is one of the slowest characters, has a pickaxe that, when he is low on health, he can use to gain speed. This helps him beat a hasty retreat when things aren't going his way. The pyro, whose job it is to set people on fire, has an axe that does more damage to burning players. Do you see what I mean? Each of their weapons is designed to work with the character. This allows the player to plan and create tactics around this synergy. However, there is a mod in Team Fortress 2 known as Randomizer, in which each character is given a random set of weapons that are not necessarily designed for them. It's supposed to be random and chaotic as, unless you're lucky, synergy is completely destroyed. That's what Sonic's moveset in Lost World is like. None of his moves work in conjunction with any of his other moves. The easiest example to cite is the homing attack. The homing attack has been changed so that the reticule can target multiple enemies at once, or the same enemy multiple times. However, in order to activate this move, Sonic has to stop, stand in front of the group of enemies, and wait for the reticule to target them. Then he can use the homing attack, which drops him on the ground with absolutely no momentum. The reticule is not under the player's control, so often this results in Sonic standing still in front of a group of enemies that are charging at him, as the player waits for the homing attack to lock on. So the homing attack, rather than failing to lubricate momentum as in Sonic Adventure onwards, instead actively works to the detriment of the momentum. The bizarre thing is, during the game's auto-run sections, the homing attack dispatches entire rows of foes with absolutely no problem. So it's not a programming issue, it has to have been designed like this. Sonic also has a brand new kick attack, which functions identically to the homing attack, but rather than simply destroying enemies, it knocks them away, allowing you to smash enemies into one another like Skittles. It's cool, I like the idea a lot. But the problem is that the game never gives the player any kind of indication about what enemies you've got to use it on. You just have to experiment and take a hit every time you mistakenly believe an enemy can be destroyed with a homing attack. For example, the Snail Blaster looks like a badnik that can only be taken out with a kick. It rolls, it's got a shell, it makes perfect sense. However, it can also be taken out with a charged homing attack. On the other hand, these weak looking Anton badniks have to be kicked, otherwise they'll grab the player. I mean, did you have any idea that all of a sudden you had to kick the crab meat first? Or the egg pawn? There's no tell, resulting in a lot of trial and error and a really unclear combat system. The homing attack and the kick get in each other's way and make the function of the other move less clear. This results in a lack of synergy. The spin dash is another example. While spinning, I have to get this off my chest. What is up with the spin dash in this game? In the old games, it used to lean while it was being charged. This was in order to clearly indicate which direction Sonic would take off in once the button was released. Once he had taken off, the ball became round again as there was no need to have the player anticipate the momentum, they were already moving. In Lost World, it's the exact opposite. The ball is round when charging, giving a poor idea of what direction Sonic is facing, especially as the ball no longer follows the analog stick exactly, but it leans when it's already in motion. I know that seems like a minor complaint, but somebody would have actively had to have designed it like that. They would have actively had to have decided that the spin dash should look like this. Anyway, sorry. While spinning, the player can press the button a second time to make the spin dash go infinitely, basically functioning as this game's boost. However, if they want to maintain this momentum, they aren't allowed to make use of Sonic's double jump, parkour, or, well, any of his moves besides a single jump. So the game's best opportunity for building momentum is absolutely incompatible with the rest of Sonic's moveset. Sonic now has a run button. Now, in 1996, Super Mario 64 introduced the world to a brand new way to control 3D games. The analog stick not only afforded the player full 360-degree movement, but also allowed the player to control their speed without using up an extra button. It baffles me then that in this day and age where analog sticks are standard with every single console ever, that games still insist on using a run button. And I'm not talking about games like Generations or Skyrim where running has a detrimental effect. In these cases the binary input is beneficial as it's a very clear on-off state that you're at no risk of accidentally activating and losing some of your stamina. I'm talking about games like Sonic Lost World, where my finger was clamped over the R button for 99% of the game, when it really didn't need to be. In the interests of fairness, I have to point out that Super Mario 3D World does this as well, and it's just as daft there as it is in Lost World. Finally, we come to Sonic's parkour moves. Sonic's parkour is active so long as the player is holding the run button. However, the parkour never inherits any momentum from Sonic's previous state, and always plays out along the same arc. It's probably the most solid new mechanic, however, and I'm surprised it's taken this long for it to be implemented into a Sonic game. Running up walls was always kind of his bag. It is, like most of the game, horribly explained, and this is made even worse by the fact that the first time the game expects the player to perform certain manoeuvres, it's over a bottomless pit. I know I can't be the only person who died multiple times working out how to get this red ring in Sky Road. Finally, the Wisps also make a return, and do you remember how I said that in Sonic Colors I thought they were either going to be ubiquitous or negligible? Here, they're the latter, implemented only because they worked well for the last game. They're absolutely horrible to control as well. The level design is just as confused as the control scheme, if not more so. It even includes a timer, an absolutely archaic design choice that limits how the player can approach a level. You know how come I've been prattling on about environments this whole time? This game just gives the finger to environments and presents some of the most video gamey levels the Sonic series has ever had. It's especially frustrating in Windy Hill, where the very first thing I did when I turned on the game was to take one look at the background and go, wow, I hope I get to visit there at some point. You never do. I also like the way that they included a random loop just hanging in the middle of nowhere in case you forgot you were playing a Sonic game. Lost World feels like a nonsense world. It feels more like Mushroom Kingdom than Mobius. Oh no, wait, sorry, we're not allowed to call it Mobius, are we? Let me give you an example. There's a level called Desert Ruins that opens in, well, some desert ruins. So far, so good. The next act takes place in a lush green forest populated by bees and honeycombs. At the end of this act, you fight a boss on top of a pixel face. In the next level, you're in a bizarre nonsense dimension made of sweeties like Sweet Mountain from Sonic Colors, except that actually made sense. I appreciate the pun, but this is still really out of left field. What kinda gets me is that with a little bit of imagination applied to it, this could have been really cute. For example, how about the second act takes place in a desert palace home to a colony of bees? In the third act, bees love sugar, so it would make sense for them to have a big vault filled with sweeties that Sonic stumbles into. The context doesn't have to be super serious for it to still enhance the experience, in my opinion. This lack of cohesiveness results in some very real problems with the gameplay. The rolling pin levels, ironically, result in some very flat terrain. There are rarely any slopes or inclines that aren't at 90-degree angles. It makes for some very boxy, clunky level designs. There aren't any winding paths or hills to run down, which, combined with Sonic's start-stop movement, make the game very stiff. But it's also really inconsistent about being stiff. Sometimes Sonic will stick to the side of a platform and refuse to let go, and other times he'll rocket around the platform so fast that he'll disappear off the bottom of the screen and die. The level design can also be extremely forced. Despite the parkour system giving the player tons of scope for climbing heights, it still insists on giving the player a helping hand with springs everywhere. There are also frequently auto-running levels. While the small auto-running sections in the main levels are great as they reward exploration with some brief and uninterrupted speed, the full levels dedicated to them simply remove control from the player, forcing them to play the way the game wants them to. Unfortunately, that's not even the worst thing that the player has to contend with. The game is woefully gimmicky. There's one level where you're a snowball and you have to accumulate rings in the snow before cashing them in at a checkpoint. This concept is dropped after one level and never used again. There's one level where you're in a casino playing pinball. Never used again. Biplane level. Just one in the post-game. Never used again. There's a level where you're floating in the sky and the jump button, which is ingrained in your mind as being the button to go up, instead makes Sonic fall. There are two levels where you're underwater grinding on rails for the whole thing in what I suspect is a pastiche of Minecart Carnage and Minecart Madness from Donkey Kong Country. There are two levels in the game that have ice physics, and they are clearly not designed around these ice physics. Every time Sonic moves at anything more than a walk, he starts skating, but his jump takes on a set trajectory, and you can only damage stuff with your feet, resulting in a lot of frustration as the level is rather claustrophobic and requires some precision to get in between these fan blades. Remember how I said that Mario in Mario 64 was meticulously playtested and tweaked before any actual levels were designed? Well, let's put it this way, I doubt that was the case with Lost World. So, is it all bad? Well, it's got its moments. The first thing I really like is the removal of the ranking system, so whichever way you choose to approach the level, the game will neither praise nor punish you for it. This encourages experimentation and drastically shifts the way that the game feels for the better. It's even managed to retain the best of both worlds by ranking it in the time trial mode. If you're going for the time trials, the game gives you a very clear indication of what it expects for an S rank, and puts these rankings in a mode separate to that of the main game. The graphics are really nice, and seeing all of those old Sonic set pieces like springs, capsules, cannons, and the blurry legs really warms the barnacles of my heart, especially as they've been reimagined appropriately in 3D. The capsules especially add incentive to explore. The rings are probably the most satisfying they've ever been to collect. The hitbox for Sonic collecting rings has been expanded so you don't have to be as precise when you collect them. I have some real fun collecting the rings in this game. I could go on. The bottom line is though that Sonic Lost World is far from the worst game that I've ever played, it's just so confused. I get absolutely no thrust or cohesive direction from it. The ebb and flow of Sonic, the fluidity I've coined and then conceitedly proceeded to rub in your face was very satisfying. You gained speed, rolled into a ball, and then lost speed. Obviously there's more to it than that, but that basic idea has a lot of rhythm. The later games just have not had that rhythm, with either the controls, the level designs, or both getting in the way. But that's okay, because I don't think it's the only way to do things. Take Sonic Rush for example, which has a boost bar, but is more about asking the player to know when not to boost. If they kept boosting, they go careering off an edge. The game took into account what the boost would mean for the gameplay and designed the game accordingly. Combined with the stunt system, it's a very busy game that is less satisfying than the classic games in my opinion, but a perfect, fun and fast-paced distraction for a handheld. It had some thought put into it, and I think that shows. But Lost World is just a big pile of what? I recommend playing it at least once. It's really worth seeing just how much seemingly innocent design decisions can cause a game to contradict itself so frequently. So, I have gone over 4 different gameplay styles in this video, and that's been heavily abridged. Sonic games, nowadays especially, use new ideas incredibly often. Due to time constraints, this often results in a rushed concept that is then never reused in order to flesh it out and polish it. In fact, when it was fleshed out and polished, with the modern Sonic formula, look where it got us, what many consider to be the best Sonic game in over a decade. But otherwise, Sonic is a great big mishmash of ideas thrown at a wall, not necessarily to see what sticks, but just thrown at the wall. It's just spitballing. Do you see? Like, you know, with the title, yeah, okay. So, how can Sega fix Sonic? Well, it's simple, right? All Sonic Team have to do is pull their heads out their arses and spend some time polishing their games, right? It might not be so simple. See, Sega, according to 2 Minutes research, isn't in the best financial situation just now. I wouldn't exactly say it's in dire straits, but it's not exactly in the best position to be taking many risks. And so they frequently leverage their strongest IP, Sonic if you're just joining us, and ask Sonic Team and other devs to churn out almost yearly releases. Now, Sonic Team gets a lot of crap. Say what you like about them, seriously, say what you like about them, but they are one of the most anarchically imaginative developers out there. Look at what happens when they're allowed to stop working on Sonic stuff. We get outlandish, wonderful concepts like Rystar, Knights, Billy Hatcher, Choo Choo Rocket. But therein lies the rub, Project Rub, that was another one. Sonic Team are being allowed off the leash less and less. How do you think they feel after churning out the same series year after year? Of course Sonic's going to be a mess, it's their only creative outlet. Now, all of that is speculation on my part, but if it's true, well, if it's true, it's an admirable attitude, I think. A lot of the games are still kind of pants, but I find it difficult to be genuinely upset at Sonic Team. So, that's that. Now that I've finished looking at the gameplay of the Sonic series, I have to ask, what? Rise of Lyric? No, I'm not paying for that. I like Sonic, I'm not mental. It's £40. Imagine the amount of fish suppers I could buy with that. Anyway, like I was saying, now that I've finished looking at the gameplay of the Sonic series, I have to ask, what is it that keeps people coming back? How is it that, through thin and thin, Sonic manages to keep his head above the water? Well, I can't answer that for sure, but I have a theory. I think it's the core appeal of the series. The basic idea, sending this cool character hurtling through vibrant, surreal landscapes at ridiculous speeds, is just infinitely appealing to me. I think that if objectivity existed, we'd all have to agree that Mario is superior to Sonic in just about every way. But the one thing that Sonic has that Mario doesn't is an emotional appeal. Mario rarely even tries to present the illusion that there are consequences. It never tries to endear Peach to the player, and it rarely makes any attempt to establish the world outside of gameplay terms. Bowser nicks Peach roughly every half hour and she's yet to come to harm. I have to stress that this isn't really a criticism. Mario sacrifices everything to let the player focus on the gameplay. What this also means is that the gameplay is simply for gameplay's sake, rather than being a vessel to create excitement or pathos in the player. Which is fine, games are fun. Sonic presenting itself as a high-speed adventure taking place in a relatively consistent world, with huge, lush landscapes to zoom through to prevent Eggman from turning them into a mechanical nightmare makes it a lot more exciting to me. I think it's the same for others too. People still defend Sonic 06 despite it being almost completely worthless. And I know for a fact that when I first played Wave Ocean's max speed section, I got a bit of a thrill, because to me, the inherent idea of Sonic the Hedgehog is so strong. Anyway, I'll be exploring the inherent idea of Sonic the Hedgehog further in part 2 of Sonic Spitball, where I'll be taking a look at the non-gameplay elements of the Sonic series. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I'll see you then. Cheers!